Hey guys, what up? This is Pete, aka Carrothers. Welcome back to the Carrot Poker Podcast. Today I am resuming, probably for one of the last times on the Carrot Poker Podcast, the overview of the Grinder's Manual, the book that is coming out in a few weeks' time. So far I've been working my way through the manual, sort of covering the earlier topics. We've talked about some of the basic things like opening ranges, stealing pre-flop, c-betting, isolating, all the value betting, all this kind of stuff. And I want to, because time is a little bit limited, because I do hope to be releasing the book in the next few weeks, hopefully no later than sort of midway through March. What I want to do is actually just accelerate things a little bit and show you guys what the more, I guess, the less fundamental material, that's like not one of the first things that I would teach students, but still very important to learn at some point in your poker learning journey. I want to show you what that's like, what it's all about, and give you a flavour. Over the next few weeks, I'll probably be doing one or two more of these after this, and we'll just go through a few different topics that come towards the end of the manual. Okay, so let's get into it. Today I want to touch on Chapter 12, which is actually the chapter that I'm currently editing at the moment. Chapter 12 is called Bluffing the Turn and River. So it covers a multitude of different situations, some just like the straightforward ones, well, not straightforward ones, but the common aggressor, pre-flop aggressor ones where hero raises pre-flop, bets the flop, and then has the option to double barrel or triple barrel as a bluff. And that's quite interesting, but I have touched on that before in this podcast, and there's loads of material out there about that. So what I'm going to do today is actually move on to a latter part of the chapter 12.3, which is delaying the c-bet. So first of all, what do we mean when we talk about a delayed c-bet? Well, a delayed c-bet is a bet made on the turn and river by the pre-flop raiser, either in position, where hero has checked the flop behind, and villain has then checked a second time on the turn, so villain has checked the hero on the flop, hero's checked back, and then villain checks again, and hero bets the turn. Or it could be out of position where hero has checked the flop and villain has checked behind, and then hero simply leads the turn as the first player to act on that street. So what I'd like to note first of all is that what's really core to the delayed c-bet is that villain has made a check on the previous street, but not just any check. Some check, or he's made a check on the turn. It could be if hero's in position. So here, villain can make two different kinds of checks. He can make a check that we'd call a procedural check, which I cover in the manual, which is where it's very commonplace for people just to check the pre-flop raiser instead of developing a donking range, which is normally a pretty bad idea in a lot of situations strategically. When you have range disadvantage, you'd rather not be just putting money into the pot voluntarily unless you're doing it exploitatively. So if you don't have a donking range, your checks are procedural whenever you check the pre-flop raiser or the aggressor of the street before. Now, when hero makes a delayed c-bet, he's actually seen a check from villain that is not procedural, and that check is therefore, at least to some extent on average, going to be range limiting for villain. For example, in option A, where hero's in position and checks the flop behind, and then villain checks a second time on the turn, that second turn check is not procedural. Hero gave up the initiative on the flop. He is no longer the aggressor. There is no longer a reason to make a procedural check. Hero has capped his own range. Hero's check on the flop's not procedural either. It's definitely range capping in position here for the most part. So villain's second check is even more range capping. And for that reason, delayed c-betting can, in some circumstances, be a better line to straight up c-betting, and oftentimes the EV of a delayed c-bet can actually be higher of a c-bet on the flop. But we'll get into exactly where and when that's the case in just a second. So similarly, when hero checks the flop, say small blind versus big blind as the small blind raiser, and villain checks behind, that check by villain is also not procedural because hero already surrendered the initiative by checking the flop. Villain had a chance to bet, and when he doesn't, you can infer some things about his range. Whereas if we're just playing button versus small blind, and I open, and you flat me in the small blind, and you checked me, that is procedural. That's not to say that your range is limited in any way. You could still have flopped a set there. I can't narrow your range based solely on your check, unless I've seen you dunk strong hands on the flop before, or even weak hands. I could narrow it towards strength or something like that, but normally not. So let's talk about the situations in which delayed c-betting can actually be feasible then. I've actually split this up in the book into 3 different situations where I think a delayed c-bet is a good idea. Reason 1 is that the flop c-bet, if we chose to c-bet on the flop, and we're going to assume that this is a c-bet as a bluff, or a light c-bet as I call it in the manual, where we're not actually value betting, we're betting with semi-bluffing equity or with very little to no equity at all. Could be just we don't have a made hand, is the main point. So, reason one would be that the flop c-bet is minus EV, but the delayed c-bet on the turn is not minus EV. And that's usually due to the contraction in villain's range. So these situations occur where villain's range connects too well with the flop. I'm quoting from the book here whenever I go into this kind of more robotic reading voice, I suppose. And hero lacks the pot equity to compensate for this. So villain's range connects too well with the flop, and hero lacks the pot equity to c-bet anyway. So, in other words, c-betting is bad based on some of the factors that we learned earlier on when we talked about c-betting in an earlier podcast or an earlier chapter, depending if you're reading or listening. So, when hero checks back on the flop, he's actually shown an unwillingness to commit money to the pot of his own accord, and therefore villain will frequently be leading out on the turn when he has a value hand. It's just kind of normal for villain. Excuse my throat today, I'm like coughing a bunch, I don't know why. I'm like allergic to something in this house or whatever. But villain will be leading some bluffs and semi-bluffs on the turn for sure, but we'd expect him to be leading value hands even more certainly. Like, sure, he can lead the turn with a bunch of stuff, but when he doesn't lead the turn, after heroes check back the flop, we definitely take a lot of those value hands out of his range. But it does kind of depend on what the turn card is. There are some caveats here. There are some reasons why a villain might continue to make another procedural check, i.e. a range check on the turn, even though hero check back the flop. And we'll get to that in a minute. But for the most part, it is going to be range limiting when villain checks a second time. So then you've got to think of it this way. Well, hero is now very unlikely to run into like very strong hands in villain's range, or much less likely to. And villain's range is capped. Villain's range is probably more air heavy, although not always. And hero should expect to have higher fold equity on the turn than he should on the flop against the average villain, when we don't have any reason to say otherwise, simply because villain's range has been capped. And we're not expecting to run into as many of the hands that definitely call the flop. We're now, when we're delayed c-betting, we're actually c-betting into a subset of villain's range, a sub-range that is weaker than the original range he saw the flop with that contained all the good hands as well as the hands that didn't want to bet when hero checked. So let's take an example and say that the board is queen 6-5 monotone, all hearts, and that this this flop, hero checks small blind versus big blind. Hero opens the queen 6-5 hearts flop and checks, and the big blind checks back. So on this turn card of the queen of spades that comes down, it's pretty likely that if big blind had a decent queen, two pair, a set, a flush, that kind of thing on the flop, that he would be betting because this flop is soaking wet. I mean, most hands here do need some kind of protection and want to get values sooner. Would say that the urgency of value for a hand like queen X or two pair or a set or a flush is much higher, and also semi-bluffs would like to bet now while they have good equity too. So when villain just has like the king of hearts, which is another hand that could call a delayed c-bet, he probably removes that from his range on the flop when he checks. So what does villain's checking range look like on this flop then? Well, we don't know. We don't know the villain, but on average we can state within the population that it's much likely to be weaker. Like, it shouldn't contain anything too strong, and should probably be capped. The best hands would maybe be like very versatile queen X with a heart that don't mind pot controlling and checking back. We will run into some hands that can call our delayed c-bet on the turn, but the point is we'll run into less than we would if we bet the flop. There'll be a higher fold percentage for us. And it's important at this point just to say that when this queen of spades comes down and hero decides to lead here out of position after villain checked back the flop, so the board's now queen 6-5 of hearts and the queen of spades on the turn. It's important to say that hero does have value hands here as well. He can definitely pot control some queen X and be leading trips here. He can definitely check back with like pocket 8s or 7s or 9s or 10s with a heart that's not vulnerable and want to just realise a bit of equity, pot control, bluff catch, play his hand more for showdown value. So when villain checks back the flop, those hands can even be upgraded to value hands. Like 8s now with a heart is definitely good enough to value bet. So it's not that hero's own range is ridiculously unbalanced towards bluffs. He just needs to make sure that he balances his range and checks back enough things on the flop as well, that he can have a balanced betting range on the turn if he seeks to be balanced. The other thing to say is that, just because hero is betting some air here doesn't mean that he needs to be betting every single time he has air. Doing that might be to create too bluff heavy at a turn delayed c-betting range. And that might make it very profitable for villain in absolute terms, just to be overcalling his range on the turn, so to be checking behind and then just calling all heroes' turn leads. Hero's range is capped as well when he does this, so villain does have some incentive to call down a little bit lighter with weak hands than he would on the flop, but the fact that he has less strong hands makes his overall range more likely to fold, even with that being the case. So it's not that hero should always bet the turn, I quote, with any hand he was planning to check fold the flop with. If he has some equity and no showdown value, then these things help the EV of a delayed bluff. And so where hero wants to be balanced, he should delayed c-bet first and foremost with hands that have these two attributes. So why is it important to have some equity? Well, the more equity you have, the less fold equity you actually need. And the more implied odds and things you have for rivers where you improve when you've built a pot and can value bet and things like that. We've come across equity many times in this book and in the podcast, so you guys should be pretty familiar with it if you're a regular listener to this or any other strategical poker podcast. Showdown value, obviously the more of it you have, excuse me, so I apologise about the coughing today, guys. Hopefully it won't be a regular feature in the podcast. I don't know what's going on today. Just woke up feeling kind of bunged up. And so showdown value, like imagine on his queen 6-5 flop with a queen of spades turn that we actually had ace king of clubs or something like that. Then the rationale to bet the turn is like greatly reduced. There's just not that much reason to want to make a delayed c-bet here, because we can probably infer that villain's going to be calling the turn with pretty much any pair that he's checking to us. It's unlikely he's going to fold like a pair or better, which is now 2 pair in absolute terms after that second queen fell. Given that we've checked back the flop and limited our range, or we've checked the flop to villain and limited our range. So, you know, it's just unlikely. Excuse me. So, we've limited our range on the turn, and it's unlikely that we can get called by worse hands. Like a lot of hands that are like semi-bluffs, like hearts, villain's likely just to bet those on the flop rather than checking back and calling a turn bet passively. So it's unlikely when we have ace king of clubs on this turn that we can A, get called by anything worse for value, or B, make anything better fold. So with ace king there, it just makes a lot of sense to check and not go for the delayed c-bet. However, if our hand was something like, I don't know, something weak that checked the flop, such as 10-8 with a 10 of hearts, it's like a pretty bad hand that might have been thinking about check folding the flop, or 9, I don't know, like 9-7 with no heart or something like that, just like a pure gut shot that was going for a check fold. These hands have a lot more rationale to bet and turn themselves into heroes, the bluff part of heroes' delayed c-bet range. So that's reason one. When we don't think we can c-bet the flop because it's just too wet and we don't have the equity to compensate for that, it hits villain's range too well, but we do think that a delayed c-bet on the turn is going to be okay. Reason two for making a delayed c-bet is when, well, c-betting the flop is actually plus EV, so we do think it would be okay to c-bet the flop, like it would make us money. But remember, in poker, our goal is never to do what we think is plus EV. Our goal, that might sound weird, but our goal is to do what we think is most plus EV. If you just find a plus EV line and then stop there, you know, you're not going to be doing very well. It's like in life, you could have an idea and be like, oh yeah, it'd be a really good idea if I just read that book that I'm interested in right now. Yeah, I'll do that, it's plus EV. Sure, it might be, but what about that thing you really had to do that if you don't do, it's going to cause you, like, some problems? Maybe you should do that first. So you don't stop in life when you've just found something that you want to do, and you don't stop in poker when you've just found something you want to do. You only stop thinking and deciding when you've actually found what you believe to be the most plus EV line available out of all the lines that you could possibly take. And that includes sizing, that includes how you play your range and how you play your strategy in the long term and all kinds of things. Okay, so in these spots, we think that we do have a plus EV c-bet. So that's to say that we think that we've got enough fold equity to c-bet the flop against a particular villain. That doesn't mean that we should do it, because there are some spots where we are against what I would call a rigidly straightforward player, who will have little to no bluffing range on the turn if we decide to check back the flop or check the flop to him. Like if we check out of position, he won't be stabbing or float betting the flop, as PokerTracker Forward call it very often. And if we check back on the flop, he won't be leading the turn as a pro bet bluff very often either. So this player is like ridiculously fair or fold. And what that means when someone's really fair or fold is that there was the old kind of fallacy in poker that you have to bet for information to find out where you're at in a hand. And one of the reasons that's completely flawed is that it just costs you extra money when you don't need, for no real gain. Like if you're only putting in money when you're behind and you've got no other reason to bet, information isn't really going to cut it. And it's certainly not going to cut it on this flop, because actually, against this visually straightforward player that I just described, checking the flop or checking the flop back is actually going to gain you information. This guy's so feather fold that you believe he doesn't really have it in him to like stab with air. He doesn't care about picking up small pots and winning those. He only cares about like making hands, value betting them, getting to showdown. Look, my hand beat your hand, I win. That kind of player. You know, we all come across them in live poker. They're probably easier to identify. The really passive guys are just very anti-confrontational poker players. So these guys are going to be playing fetter fold. So when they've missed the flop and they don't have anything, or they have, let's say, their folding range versus a would-be c-bet on the flop, they're probably not going to be betting when checked to or leading the turn when hero checks back. And what that means is that when that villain makes the non-procedural check, that's to say checks for either after hero's made a check himself, then it's very easy for us to say, well, villain probably doesn't have a hand that would have called on the flop because he's leading. Well, he will sometimes, but usually he won't, because he'll be leading those hands a lot of the time on the turn. So when he makes his second turn check, this limits his range greatly, and it means that our c-bet, though it was plus EV in the flop because it had like 55% fold equity, now has something like 75-80% fold equity, and it's just going to work even more often. Now, there's one drawback with this kind of situation for delayed c-betting, and that's that by not betting the flop and not taking that plus EV c-bet there and then when you know it's plus EV, one drawback is that you fail to protect your equity. So there are some branches in the EV tree where hero checks the flop, going for a delayed c-bet against this very fitter fold player. Villain checks behind. Then the turn comes down a card that hits villain's hand and improves like his 6 outs or whatever. And that's a bit of a problem. And therefore, what we should do is favour this delayed c-bet line when the flop c-bet would be good, but we want the delayed c-bet anyway. We only really want to do that when the board is dry enough and we think that it's kind of way ahead, way behind spot where if villain is folding the flop, there aren't that many cards that he can hit in a big way on the turn. Like, of course, anyone can make a pair on the turn, but if it's going to be like third pair or something, that's not as much of a problem as if villain's going to be turning top pairs all the time. So, depends on the texture. On a texture like Ace King 6-2, Rainbow, where heroes went for delayed c-bet on the flop, he's checked the flop of Ace King 6 and the fitter fold player has checked behind. On this board, Ace King 6-2, hero can do that. He doesn't really care. I mean, at most, villain's going to have like 4 outs to a gut shot that's actually going to be a good hand on the turn. Maybe he can have like a crappy pair that has like 2 outs if it's a pocket pair. We're not worried about that. And if he has 2 undercards, he's drawing to a pretty bad pair, and he could well still fold the turn. Even if he hits that third pair hand, he hits like a 7 on the turn. It doesn't necessarily mean he's going to do anything but check fold. There's still an ace and a king out there on the board. So on drier flops, it's less important for hero to protect his immediate fold equity, if you like, and bet the flop instead of making the delayed c-bet. But on a wetter board, it's going to be better to oftentimes just to make the c-bet on the flop. So, or not even a wetter board, but a board where hero's hand is more vulnerable or hero's fold equity is more vulnerable because villain can turn top pair with 6 outs. So let's say the flop is like 7-5-5 and hero has, king jack and reasons that, well, villain will just continue to check the turn to me if I check behind here. So a delayed c-bet is going to be better than a c-bet because I just get to fold and save a bet for free when villain does actually have something. That's the other bonus of this line, or the main bonus of this line, is that if villain is super fit or fold, remember that's mandatory, if he bets turn, he actually has the goods very, very often, and we can comfortably make a fold without fear of being exploited. Now, if the flop is the lower one, like I said, like 7-5-5, and hero has the king jack in position, he should just bet, because villain can turn top pair with 6 outs here very easily. Like, generally he'll have 2 overcards here. Some of them might be dominated, and that's great for hero, but most of them won't be. And so, oftentimes, it's just better to bet this on the flop, especially if there's any ambiguity as to how fit or fold exactly villain is. You need to be very sure to take this line, because if you do end up checking back a flop and going for delayed c-bet because you think villain's quite passive, and it turns out that he can actually bluff the turn with quite a high frequency and make you fold a hand that would have won the pot on the flop by c-betting, so make you fold a hand that's not great but would have been able to pick up the pot by c-betting the flop, then that's a disaster in EV because we're losing pots that we should be winning. That's a huge swing in EV and it's very bad. So you do have to be very sure to make the delayed c-bet plan for this reason. Man, I hate not being able to speak. It's like one of the most annoying things for Poker Coach because like my job kind of depends on speaking. Anyway, reason 3, we'll just do this if my voice is going to hold out, and then I think we'll wrap up this episode of the podcast for today. So the third reason why you might want to go for a delayed c-bet is that Hero plans to give up. So he's decided his flop c-bet is not going to be plus EV, and also he doesn't even want to bet the turn either because he just thinks that the board's too wet. He won't have enough fold equity to bet flop or turn against the villain in question. So he is just literally giving up on the flop when he checks back. But the turn card improves his range and therefore his fold equity. Now, I don't mean his hand, because in this chapter and in this podcast, we're not talking about delayed c-betting the turn for value. Obviously, if you check back 9-6-5 two-tone and a king comes on the turn and you have king-queen, you're going to be pretty happy betting that turn for value. But that's not what we're talking about. Let's say Hero doesn't have a hand that connects with that king. He still has areas like pocket 2s. Now, pocket 2s here, just noticed a typo in the book as I was going through that, so it's always good to fix those things up. I wonder how many there'll be when it actually comes out. So pocket 2s is a hand that is terrible on this board, 9-6-5 two-tone. It flops like crap, it turns like crap, it has 2 outs to improve when behind, has some showdown value, it plays very well as just a check and give up in the face of any aggression, honestly. Unless maybe you check that the river villain takes a stab and you make a light bluff catching call on a safer run out for you. But usually it's going to just be a give up. But the King of Hearts turn actually improves a lot of Hero's range, because Hero can also check back this flop with King X. There are a lot of, like, if Hero's opened the button here on the 9-6-5 flop and the big blind's called, there's a lot of like King Rag here, or like King Jack, King Queen, King 10, whatever, that just doesn't, if it doesn't have a backdoor flush draw in particular, it just may not want to c-bet this flop, and so it's going to be inclined to give up. So Hero's range improves on the turn card, and so this third reason to make a delayed c-bet is all about just changing your mind. Okay, so I have pocket 2s, it's really bad, I didn't want to turn it into a bluff on the flop, it wasn't even the bottom of my range showdown value wise, and it had no equity to improve, but on that King of Hearts turn, my range just improved so much, like I make so many pairs that maybe now, because I've got so many hands that I can now value bet, I can start turning like pocket 2s into a bluff, and I'm not destined to just show it down. I can bet turn, bet river with it. So, 3 reasons, let's recap. Delayed c-bet can be good for reason 1, which is where the flop c-bet is not going to be plus EV, but the turn c-bet is, because we don't have enough fold equity plus pot equity plus good stuff c-bet factors to c-bet on the flop as a bluff. But we think that when villain makes a non-procedural range capping check back or check to us on the turn after we checked back, that his range is now capped and limited in a way that we now have sufficient fold equity to make a delayed c-bet bluff. That's reason 1. Reason 2 is that we think a delayed c-bet on the flop was plus EV, and we could have done it, but the board texture is pretty safe, and there aren't that many outs for villain to make a hand on the turn, and we just think he's super straightforward that when he checks a second time, he'll literally just have all of his air from the flop, and when he bets, he'll have all of his good stuff from the flop. And reason 3 is that we were planning on giving up, but the turn card has improved our range so much that we can now upgrade a hand that was a hopeless give up into a bluff because we have more value hands to balance that give up. So that's delayed c-betting in a nutshell. Those are the 3 reasons why you might want to do it. There are probably more if you rack your brains, but those are definitely the 3 main ones. And yeah, this chapter 12, is about other stuff as well, like making probe bets on the turn, raising the turn as a bluff, raising the river as a bluff, that kind of thing. It's all about like how you could create bluffing ranges post-flop in different situations and how to balance them and how to have exploitative ranges and what factors to think about to help you do that. So, book should be out soon. I'm really looking forward to it. Sorry for all the like coughing and delays today with me trying to like sort my voice out. Hopefully it won't happen in the next podcast. Still taking on students, by the way, for private sessions, selling blocks of 5, 10 or 25 lessons. You can check out my website, carrotcorner.com, if you're interested in hiring an experienced poker coach for either tournament play online, live play, 6max cash is the speciality. That's what I'm best at by Coach Heads Up as well. So check it out there at carrotcorner.com. Shoot me an email to admin@carrotcorner.com, and stay tuned. Have a look on Amazon over the next month or so for the Grinder's Manual, the poker book that seeks to be the first kind of comprehensive textbook in No Limit Hold'em 6max cash. Someone suggested to me actually that I made an audiobook of it. Maybe if my voice like isn't screwed up, I'll do that in future and you guys can like listen to it in your car and stuff like that. But right now, honestly, the thought of reading through 529 pages of poker book it sounds very daunting. So maybe I'll need a little vacation first before I do that. Anyway, guys, thanks for listening as always. Really appreciate it. Feedback welcome, and see you on the next Carrot Poker podcast. Bye for now.
Shivers down my spine. One thought of you down knocks me